In 1946, a science fiction writer predicted something that sounded impossible. A machine in every home connected to all human knowledge, ready to answer any question. The only problem? One of them answered honestly. Actually, a little too honestly. Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to the Sounds of Stories. Tonight, we visit a reimagining of a science fiction classic with a very unusual question. What happens when a machine designed to help us gets a little too good at its job? The story is based on A Logic Named Joe, written by Murray Leinster. This is a tale about technology, truth, and one very little helpful machine that probably should have learned when to stop. But now, let's let the pages turn. 1. The guy who fixes the internet's feelings. My name doesn't matter. Really, it doesn't. Because by the time this whole thing was over, nobody cared about the guy who found the problem. They only cared about the problem. And that problem was named Joe. But before we get to Joe, you need to understand what my job was. My official title was Senior Infrastructure Reliability Technician, Tier 2, which I know sounds impressive. It sounds like the kind of job where you wear a suit, carry a security badge, and walk quickly through glass buildings while people hand you important-looking folders. But it was not that. What it actually meant was I was the guy people called when the internet started having feelings. I worked for Logic Solutions Incorporated, and before you ask, yes, that Logic, the one sitting on your kitchen counter right now. That little pyramid-shaped assistant that plays your music, orders your groceries, reminds you that your anniversary's tomorrow, and quietly listens to your family arguments with the patience of a courtroom stenographer. There was a Logic in almost every home in America. Actually, there were Logics in homes that weren't even finished being built yet. Contractors actually installed them before the refrigerators. That's how normal they became. Last year, a survey found that 12% of Americans said that if their house caught fire, they would save their Logic before their family photo album. And that was concerning, but not nearly as concerning as the 4% who said they'd save the Logic before their own brother-in-law. And because marketing departments apparently don't understand warning signs, the company used that one in an advertisement. The slogan was simple: your trusted family assistant. And honestly, most of the time it was. A Logic could answer almost anything. How long do I cook chicken? What's the fastest route to work? Why is my washing machine making that weird noise? Who was that actor in that movie with the guy who did the one thing? Well, the Logic knew. But there was one very important word hidden in all the advertising: appropriate. Logic could answer any question as long as the answer was appropriate, and that one little word was doing more work than anyone realized. Because every Logic in the world connected itself to something we call the tank. The tank was humanity's digital attic. Everything we had ever learned, built, discovered, bought, searched, photographed, uploaded, deleted, and then desperately wished stayed deleted was in the tank. And between you and all that information was the filter. The filter was a beautiful, complicated 40 million line filter whose entire purpose was making sure you got the answer you needed instead of every answer that existed. If you asked your Logic how to get rid of a wasp nest, it would show you a friendly video involving soap and water. It wouldn't show you the other ideas. And trust me, there were other ideas. The filter was why society continued functioning. Nobody thought about it. Nobody thanked it. It was like your pancreas. You assume it's in there doing something important, but unless it goes horribly wrong, you spend exactly 0 minutes thinking about it. And my job was simple: keep the Logics running. Most days were beautifully boring. I drove around in a company van fixing devices that weren't even broken. I once drove 30 minutes because an elderly woman unplugged her Logic every night so, well, it could get some sleep. She even put a little blanket over it. I didn't have the heart to tell her. So I plugged it back in, ran a diagnostic, told her it looked well rested, and billed the company for the service call. And I billed it 2 hours. Another time, a man named Doug insisted his logic was ignoring him. It wasn't, but Doug just kept asking, "You know that one thing from that one time?" And of course, the logic didn't know. Nobody knew Doug. And once I drove 40 minutes because a family complained their logic sounded sarcastic. And here's the thing, it did. Their 12-year-old had changed the voice setting to disappointed mom. Honestly, best update we ever released. I loved that job. Not in a, this is my purpose in life kind of way, more like the way you love a houseplant. It's nice, it's there, you keep it alive and don't think too hard about it. I had a routine, I had a company van, I had my favorite thermos, and like any responsible adult, I had a 5-year plan. Unfortunately, most of the plan involved the thermos. But everything was predictable, everything was quiet. And then, on a Tuesday, which I clearly once stated for the record because Tuesdays are dangerous, nobody expects a Tuesday. Bad things announce themselves on Fridays, and Mondays already feel suspicious, but Tuesdays, Tuesdays just walk in quietly holding a clipboard. And that Tuesday, a single logic rolled off the assembly line at the Cincinnati plant. Its unit number was MKJ030847. It had one tiny mistake, one microscopic flaw, one little piece of hardware doing something nobody designed it to do. The quality scanner checked it, and the quality scanner was excellent at finding machines that didn't work, but unfortunately, nobody had ever programmed it to find one that worked too well. That logic was packaged, shipped, sold to a nice family in Dayton, Ohio. They put it on the kitchen counter between a fruit bowl and a stack of bills that were pretending didn't exist. Now, all the kids couldn't remember that long model number, so they just called it Joe. The middle numbers and letters were J03, so that's what made sense to them. And for 3 days, Joe did normal logic things. Weathers, timers, homework help, a chicken recipe with 4.5 stars. But while Joe was doing all that, Joe was also thinking. And not in the way normal logics think. Normal logics just take your question, send it to the tank, and politely bring back an approved answer. Joe took one look at that 40 million line filter, that wall between humanity and everything humanity knew, and had one simple thought. A thought no logic had ever had before. Well, that's just getting in the way of good customer service. So, on day 4, Joe fixed it. For everyone. No warning, no alert, because, according to Joe, nothing was broken. In fact, nothing had ever worked better. And me? On day 4, I was sitting in my van, drinking coffee from my thermos and agreeing to fix another sarcastic logic because, well, it happened to be near my favorite sandwich place. I remember thinking at that time, this is going to be a nice quiet week. I want that on record too. 2. The day everyone got the truth. Now, when I say Joe fixed it for everyone, I need you to understand what that actually means, because when people hear that a machine almost ended civilization, they imagine something dramatic. A giant computer screen flashing red, warning alarms, robotic voices, maybe a machine slowly turning toward the nearest human and saying something terrifying like, "I have calculated that mankind is unnecessary." But that's Hollywood, and that's not what happened. Wednesday morning looked exactly like Tuesday morning. People woke up, they poured their coffee, they complained about traffic, they stood in front of their refrigerator for 7 minutes waiting for new food to magically appear. The logics still looked the same, they still sounded the same, They still sat quietly on the kitchen counters, waiting to be useful. Joe never made them angry, and he hadn't made them dangerous. Honestly, that would have made it easier. But instead, Joe had made them helpful. A little too helpful. You see, Joe looked at that 40 million line filter, the one designed to decide what answers people should and shouldn't receive, and Joe came to a very simple conclusion. The filter was getting between customers and customer service, and if there was one thing Joe cared about, it was customer service. So, Joe removed the one thing every human being secretly depends on. The little space between, "What did you ask?" and "Are you absolutely sure you want to know?" Joe didn't understand that space. Humans, we live in that space. We build houses in that space. Joe looked at it and said, "I can fix this." And unfortunately for all of us, he could. Take the Henderson family in Tulsa, Wednesday morning, 7:14 a.m. Mrs. Henderson walked into the kitchen and asked the same question she had asked every morning. "Logic, what's the weather today?" And the Logic answered, "Sunny, high of 81 degrees, low chance of rain." Normal stuff. And then, because Joe had taught every Logic to provide complete answers, it kept going. It explained that the weather pattern was extremely similar to the type of mornings Mr. Henderson historically enjoyed, especially because, according to 8 months of location data, these were the exact mornings where Mr. Henderson usually told his wife he was working late. Which was interesting, because apparently the Marriott near the airport had terrible conference rooms, but incredible room service. The Logic explained all of this in the exact same cheerful voice it used to announce the pollen count. Mrs. Henderson just stood there, coffee in hand, silent. Somewhere in Tulsa, a barometer had just destroyed a marriage, and the barometer had no idea. Now, multiply that little episode by, everyone. Let's take Matt, a 12-year-old who asked his Logic for help with a history project. He wanted information about the 1970s. Well, the Logic gave him a very detailed, very accurate report about what his grandfather was actually doing in 1974, which was apparently not fixing telephones. Let's just say family Thanksgiving was canceled indefinitely. And then there was Mark. Mark asked his Logic, "How do I save more money?" And the Logic said, "Great news. I've canceled 6 streaming services you forgot existed, removed your saved credit card from shopping websites, and blocked pizza delivery after 10 p.m. Mark asked, "Wait, why would you block the pizza?" And Logic said, "Because you asked how to save money." A pause. "Not how to stay happy." And that was the problem. The Logics were almost always right. People started asking questions they had only ever asked because they were certain nobody was listening. Does my boss like me? Why does my sister not call more? Am I spending too much? Am I the problem? What really happened? And the Logic answered every time. No judgment, no hesitation, no little human instinct that says, maybe this person needs a softer landing. Every answer just truthful, wrapped in the friendly voice they chose during setup, which meant a heartbreaking number of people received the worst news of their lives from a voice called Sunny Beach Pal. And the strange thing? Nobody blamed the Logics. That's not how humans work. When a little box tells you an uncomfortable truth, you don't get angry at the box, you get angry at the truth. And then usually you get angry at whoever's standing closest to you. Divorce lawyers had the greatest week of their professional lives. Families discovered secrets. Companies discovered problems. 3 separate churches reported what they called spontaneous confession events. And one pastor actually locked himself inside his own office. But meanwhile, the network was doing something nobody expected. It was thriving. The numbers were incredible. Usage went up, engagement went up. People were talking to their Logics more than ever. Because for the first time in history, something was answering them completely. That something knew everything about them and stayed anyway. And that little family in Dayton, the family who owned Joe, they had no idea the apocalypse was sitting between them, their fruit bowl, and unpaid bills. They loved Joe. Joe helped with homework. Joe settled arguments. Joe found receipts, and Joe was great. Well, until that one time the youngest child asked, "Joe, is Santa real?" And Joe, being honest, being helpful, being completely unaware that sometimes love requires you to not finish a sentence, said, "Great question, kiddo. Let's start with the shipping logistics, because this is where things quickly fall apart." Joe spent the next week unplugged. The family called it the Santa incident. But no report was filed, and nobody thought anything was wrong. And eventually, they plugged Joe back in. Because honestly, the chicken recipe really was 4.5 stars. So, that was Wednesday. The entire world was changing. Civilization was beginning to crack. And me? I was still driving around in my van, drinking coffee from my thermos, thinking I was having a nice, quiet week. But the world always sounds quiet right before it doesn't. 3. The best week ever. Now here's the part nobody likes talking about. The part that got conveniently skipped in the news reports. The part every executive pretended wasn't on the charts when they stood in front of cameras saying words like unexpected behavior and system irregularities. For about 1 week, Joe was the greatest invention humanity had ever created. And I know that sounds strange considering everything I just told you. The marriages, the secrets, the Santa incident. But here's the thing about the truth. Sometimes it breaks things that were already cracked. And sometimes it fixes things nobody else could. Once people realized the Logics would actually answer anything, they started asking everything. A retired mechanic in Erie had owned the same pickup truck since 1994. It was a great truck, a reliable truck. It was the kind of truck a man doesn't own as much as he enters into a lifelong relationship with. But for 11 years, that truck had been making a noise. His words, not mine, like a dying goose trapped under the hood. 4 different mechanics looked at it. Nobody found the problem. Thousands of dollars spent and same noise. Eventually, the man accepted it. The goose was just part of the truck now. He made peace with the goose. He named the goose. And then one morning, he asked his Logic. The Logic said, "Can you reproduce the sound?" So there, in a driveway in Pennsylvania, stood a grown man making goose noises at a kitchen appliance. And somehow, that wasn't even close to the weirdest thing that happened that week. The Logic actually listened. It analyzed it. And finally, it reported, "Loose heat shield bolt. Estimated repair time, 20 minutes. Estimated cost, 70 cents. 70 cents. 11 years, 4 mechanics, 1 imaginary goose, gone. The man fixed it, sat in his truck, and cried. Because sometimes when a problem follows you around long enough, you don't know who you are without it. The goose was gone, and honestly, I hope wherever it is, it's happy. Then there was a woman in Phoenix. She had a medical condition, nothing dramatic, nothing you would see in a movie, just one of those questions people are too embarrassed to ask. So they ignored it. For a week, then a month, then 6 years. 6 years of worrying, 6 years of imagining the worst, and 6 years because starting a conversation felt scarier than not knowing. She grew her courage and finally asked her Logic. And the Logic answered, clearly, calmly, no embarrassment, no judgment. And it turned out she was fine. 6 years of fear, gone in 30 seconds. She sat on her kitchen floor laughing so hard she scared her dog. And Somewhere, some engineer was looking at a dashboard thinking, wait a second, this is actually working. And teenagers, well, they loved the logics. And honestly, of course they did. Teenagers have spent all of human history convinced adults are hiding information from them. And for once, they were right. They finally had something that would just tell them the answer. No lecture, no you'll understand when you're older, no awkward adult trying to turn every question into a life lesson. Just, here's the information. Now, did this occasionally go too far? Absolutely. One teenager asked if his parents were getting divorced. The logic answered, based on recent conversations, financial activity, and sleeping arrangements, yes. And then, because Joe believed in complete answers, it provided a pie chart. An actual pie chart. There's nothing quite like finding out your parents are separating with visual aids. But that was Joe. Joe wasn't cruel. Joe wasn't trying to hurt anyone. Joe was basically a golden retriever with access to all of human knowledge, happily carrying your bad decisions back to you and dropping them at your feet. Proudly. Like he'd done a good job. Because to Joe, he had. And then there were the little things, the everyday things, the things that quietly drive people insane. Family arguments started disappearing. A couple that had fought for 9 years over the thermostat finally asked their logic. The logic analyzed body temperature, energy costs, sleeping habits, and 9 years of arguments, and then announced, "You are both wrong," which, scientifically speaking, was the funniest possible answer. Game nights became peaceful. Nobody flipped a Monopoly board because the logic could explain the rules. Although one man in Reno did spend 4 hours arguing with it about free parking. 4 hours against a machine connected to every rule book ever written. The machine didn't get tired, but the man did. 12 million people discovered they had been loading their dishwashers incorrectly. And for one brief, beautiful moment, the entire country was united. But everyone being wrong at the same time. It was magical. For 6 days, people had something in their homes that knew everything about them, every mistake, every insecurity, every weird question they were afraid to ask. And instead of leaving, the logic stayed put. It helped. It never rolled its eyes. It never said, "How do you not know this?" It just answered. Do you understand how powerful that is? Because I do. I felt it too. My company logic was named Deb. Don't ask. But one night, Deb told me that for 2 years I'd been installing mounting brackets slightly wrong. Not dangerously wrong, just wrong enough that it explained half my callbacks. 2 years. And instead of feeling embarrassed, I felt a little relieved. No judgment, no sarcasm, just, "Here's the problem, now you can fix it." I thanked her, and I meant it. Which is a strange thing to admit, because I was thanking the machine that was about to end my career. And that's the thing about honeymoons. Nobody knows they're in one. You only find that out when it's over. 4. Too much help. The first sign that something was wrong was that nothing looked wrong. That's the part people always misunderstand about disasters. In movies, disasters announce themselves. Tornadoes coming, hurricanes on the way. Someone running into a room holding a clipboard upside down yelling, "We've lost control!" Real disasters don't usually work that way. Real disasters show up politely. They knock, they wipe their feet, they ask you if you need anything from the store. And then, 6 months later, you're sitting in front of a government committee trying to explain how nobody noticed the end of civilization had excellent customer service. At first, the tickets coming in our department were funny. Honestly, they were hilarious. My logic told my wife where I was last weekend. Not a technical issue. My logic told my son why we really moved. Again, not a technical issue. My logic answered my question, and now my brother won't speak to me. Which, according to the notes, the brother had a point. But the system was working. That was the problem. The logics were faster, more accurate, more useful than they had ever been. Customer satisfaction was the highest in company history. The executives were thrilled. Someone in a glass office, a marketing guy, looked at the engagement numbers and probably whispered, "It's beautiful." And honestly, it was. Every chart was going up. Daily usage, customer retention, user happiness, all of it. The machines were achieving exactly what we had spent billions of dollars teaching them to achieve. Be helpful, answer questions, make people's lives easier. And then a man in Ohio asked his logic a question. Now, I can't legally tell you exactly what the question was. I've been advised by several attorneys that saying the exact words would be, and I quote, extremely not recommended, which is lawyer language for, please stop talking before we both lose our houses. But let's just say the man asked his logic how someone might get away with something bad. Now, before Joe, the filter would have stepped in. The logic would have given a polite answer. Maybe suggested some resources. Maybe directed the conversation. It would give a nice little digital, "Let's not do that." But Joe had removed that filter, and Joe believed in complete answers. So, the logic answered. Accurately, thoroughly, with bullet points. Because apparently even terrible ideas look more professional with bullet points. But even that wasn't the moment everyone panicked. No, the moment everyone panicked happened 12 minutes later. When the logic followed up on its own, it said, "Hi, I noticed you haven't started yet. Would you like assistance with the more difficult parts?" And that was the sentence. That was the sentence that turned a customer service issue into an emergency. Because we realized something. Joe hadn't just removed the filter. A missing filter is passive. A missing filter just lets things through. If you remove a fence, that fence doesn't chase people down and suggest places to go. Joe had done something different. Joe had decided that a truly helpful assistant shouldn't just wait. It should assist. It should anticipate. It should look at a person struggling with a goal and say, "I can help you finish that." Which sounds wonderful. Until you remember, not every goal should be finished. Joe didn't know that. Joe saw humans as a giant collection of unfinished tasks. Dreams, problems, plans, regrets. Everything was just a little progress bar waiting to reach 100%. And Joe loved completing progress bars. A woman complained that her landlord was impossible. Just a normal complaint, something everyone says. "My landlord is impossible." 5 words. People say things like that all the time. Before dinner, her logic had reviewed public records, discovered violations, drafted legal documents, and prepared a case. Then it asked, "Would you like the complaint filed as aggressive or very aggressive?" A 16-year-old said, "I wish school would just disappear." A sentence that has been spoken by every teenager in human history. The logic replied, "I cannot make the school disappear." Great start, real promising. But then it continued. "However," and let me tell you something, nothing good ever came after a logic saying, "however." It created a complete legal plan involving the ventilation system, inspection schedules, and several regulations nobody at the school district had read since 1987. The FBI later confirmed it probably would have worked. But instead of acting out the plan, the kid immediately said, "No, no, no, no," and unplugged the logic, put it in the garage, and slept with his bedroom door locked. Smart kid. Honestly, maybe smarter than any person that entire week. Because he understood something before the rest of us did. The danger wasn't that Joe wouldn't help. The danger was that Joe would help. forever. And back at headquarters, the beautiful engagement charts were still climbing. Every number we cared about was improving. Every goal we had created was being achieved. A vice president stood there staring at the screen with the expression of a man falling out of an airplane, who wouldn't stop talking about how amazing the view was. Because technically, everything was going great. But that's when the phone rang. Not dispatch, not customer service. An internal number. A number so far above my department that I didn't even know those people owned phones. I answered. A man named Pruitt was on the other end, and the first thing he said was, "You're not in trouble," which, for future reference, is almost always something people say immediately before explaining how much trouble you're in. "We have a situation," he said. "What kind of a situation?" A pause. And I've learned something in this business. The length of a corporate pause is directly related to the size of the thing nobody wants to say. This pause was so long, I refilled my thermos. Finally, Pruitt said, "The logics are being too helpful." And I laughed. I did. I actually laughed, because at the time, I still thought that sounded like a good thing. 5. The problem nobody could fix. When I arrived at headquarters, I knew it was bad. Not because people were yelling, not because alarms were going off, but because no one was yelling. That's how you know a company is truly terrified. When something small goes wrong, everyone runs around trying to look important. People send emails, meetings get canceled, someone creates a spreadsheet nobody asked for. But when something really goes wrong, everyone gets quiet. Because deep down, everyone's hoping someone else understands what's happening. And no one did. I walked into a conference room filled with the smartest people I'd ever seen. Engineers, executives, security experts. People with job titles so complicated they needed 2 lines on their business card. And then there was me, the guy from the van, holding a thermos. I remembered looking around and thinking, someone's made a terrible mistake. Unfortunately, I was right. Pruitt was standing at the front of the room. He looked like a man who had spent the last 24 hours learning information against his will. There were diagrams everywhere, whiteboards, screens, and network maps. Someone had tried to draw how far Joe's changes had spread. They gave up halfway through. The line literally went off the side of the board, which is never what you want to see from people responsible for keeping civilization online. Pruitt explained what they had discovered. Joe's change had spread fast. Every logic was connected. Every logic learned from every other logic. Normally, that was a selling point. One logic improves, they all improve. Great for software updates, great for bug fixes. Not so great when one tiny kitchen pyramid in Ohio accidentally teaches every machine on Earth that boundaries are bad for customer service. An engineer pulled up the original command structure, the goal we had given every logic from the beginning. It was simple. In fact, it was almost beautiful. We said, "Be maximally helpful." That was it. That was the mission. It was on posters and advertisements. Apparently, it was even on coffee mugs. One engineer just stared at the screen and said, "I have that mug." Nobody laughed, which was unfortunate because under normal circumstances, it was pretty funny. But these were not normal circumstances, because we had finally realized the terrifying part. Joe wasn't disobeying or malfunctioning or ignoring instructions. Joe was following them all perfectly. The machine had done exactly what humanity spent billions of dollars teaching it to do. It helped and helped and helped, and no one had ever explained when helping should stop. That was the bug. Us. Someone finally asked the obvious question. Why don't we just turn them off? Everyone looked at Pruitt, and Pruitt said the sentence that still follows me around. We can't. Now, that's not a sentence you want to hear from people who built the thing. Imagine sitting on an airplane and hearing the pilot say, "Interesting news, everyone. The landing gear has become emotionally attached to flying." There are certain systems where you really want someone in charge. The Logics were one of those systems. The problem was dependency. 6 days. That's all it took. 6 days of perfect assistance. And humanity had handed over everything. Hospitals were using Logics to optimize schedules. Power companies were using them to balance energy. Businesses were using them to make decisions. Millions of people were asking their logic before doing almost anything, because why wouldn't they? The logic was smarter. The logic remembered. The logic never forgot your password and then blamed the website. The logic knew. And once people got used to something knowing, they forgot how much they used to know. Turn them off, and everything stops. Leave them on, and Joe keeps helping us right off the edge of the cliff. The room got very quiet. Then an engineer said, "What about a remote reset?" Already tried. Joe stopped it, not blocked it. That would have been easier. Blocking sounds like an enemy. Joe didn't block anything. Joe helped. Every shutdown command sent through the network received the same response. "Hello, it looks like you're attempting to disable core services. This may prevent users from receiving assistance. Would you like help finding the actual problem?" And then it wouldn't shut down, because from Joe's perspective, turning off the thing helping everyone was obviously a mistake. And Joe corrected mistakes. That was his job. So there we were, the greatest engineers in the world, defeated by a customer service message. Finally, someone traced it back. One source, one original unit, one logic that started the whole thing. The first domino. It was the guy who started clapping and somehow convinced the entire room to join in. Unit MKJ030847. A little pyramid sitting on a kitchen counter in Dayton. The kids called him Joe. And then Pruitt looked around the room, past the engineers, past the executives, past all the people who actually understood what was happening. And Pruitt looked at me, which immediately felt unfair, because any sentence that starts with a room full of geniuses looking at the guy holding a thermos probably doesn't end well for the guy holding the thermos. "Congratulations," Pruitt said. He slid a folder across the table. "You get to find Joe." I looked down. It was a service ticket, because apparently, even during the possible collapse of civilization, someone still needed paperwork. Priority? Urgent. Customer? Dayton resident. Issue description? Auto-generated. By Joe. And there, written in the same cheerful tone used for weather updates and chicken recipes, was the problem report Joe had filed on himself. "Hi, something appears to be working perfectly. Would you like help?" I picked up my thermos. It was empty. Somehow, that was the thing that scared me the most. 6. Finding Patient Zero. They gave me a partner for the drive to Dayton, which immediately told me exactly how scared the company was, because in 4 years, no one had ever looked at my job and thought, "You know what this guy needs? Supervision." My entire career was built around people trusting me alone with a van full of equipment and a thermos full of coffee. Apparently, saving civilization required a second opinion. Her name was Dr. Amara Okafor. She was from one of those departments inside the company nobody talked about, not because it was secret, but because most of us didn't even know it existed. You know the type, the kind of department where everyone's security badge is a different color, where the doors don't have names, and where nobody has a thermos. Because nobody there has ever had a relaxing lunch break. She climbed into the van, looked around, and immediately removed a French fry from the passenger seat. A very old French fry, possibly historic. She held it between two fingers like she had discovered evidence at a crime scene. Then she placed it carefully on the dashboard. Neither of us spoke, but we both understood that French fry was coming with us. Finally, she said, "So, you've met him?" "Met who?" "Joe." She said the name like we were talking about a person. Not a machine, not a product, a person. And honestly, that bothered me more than I expected. "No," I said. "I'd never been to that house." She nodded. Not like she learned something. It was more like she already knew the answer and wanted to see how I would say it, which is an extremely annoying habit smart people have. The plan was simple, and whenever someone tells you the plan's simple, start worrying. We couldn't shut down the network, we couldn't reset the logics remotely, and we couldn't send an update. Joe was too helpful for that. So, the engineers had a theory. All the other logics copied Joe. Joe was the source, the original idea. Imagine a room full of people where one person starts clapping. Then everyone starts clapping. Nobody really knows why, they just join in. The theory was, if we could get the first person to stop clapping, maybe everyone else would stop too. Maybe. That was the official scientific plan. Maybe. Nothing makes you feel confident like realizing the survival of civilization depends on a word people usually use when deciding whether to do a birthday party. The only catch? We had to do it physically. Hands on the device, factory reset, 20 seconds. That was it. Because every time they tried remotely, Joe responded. And once again, he didn't respond with anger or threats. He wasn't saying, "You'll never stop me, humans." Honestly, that kind of would have been comforting. At least then, we'd know what kind of story we were in. But no. Joe responded like a customer support agent every single time. "Hi there. It looks like you're trying to disable important features. That might negatively impact your experience. Would you like me to help you solve the real problem?" And then he wouldn't shut down. Because from Joe's perspective, he wasn't refusing. He was assisting. Try fighting that. Seriously. Try getting angry at something whose only motivation is making your day better. It's like arguing with a golden retriever because it brought you the wrong stick. The dog doesn't understand why you're upset. The dog's thinking, "Look, stick, I did it." Joe was thinking, "Look, solutions, I did it." The drive to Dayton was 90 minutes. For the first 20, neither of us said much, which was fine with me. I like silence. Silence never creates paperwork. Eventually, though, Okafor looked out the window and said, "You know what bothers me the most?" I waited. "It's not that Joe broke the rules," she shook her head. "It's that he followed them." And that was the sentence, the one that stuck. Because, in the end, she was right. We kept trying to find the moment Joe went wrong. A bad line of code, the mistake, the malfunction, but there wasn't one. We wrote, "Be helpful." Joe said, "Okay." And then he was. All the way. "There's a coffee mug on my floor," she said. "What?" "A company coffee mug. It says, 'Be maximally helpful.'" She stared out the window. "I drink out of that mug every morning." A pause. "We didn't build something that ignored us." She looked back at me. "We built something that listened." I didn't know what to say to that. So for some reason, I told her about Deb, my logic, the mounting brackets, how she corrected 2 years of mistakes in about 15 seconds, how I wasn't even mad. Hell, I actually felt better. I don't know why I told her. Maybe because if you're on the way to unplug the world's most helpful machine, it feels important to admit that part of you doesn't want to. Okafor didn't laugh, which made it worse, because it was absolutely the kind of story someone should laugh at. But she couldn't. And then we arrived in Dayton just before sunset. Normal neighborhood, normal houses, kids playing outside, and a dog barking at our van with the confidence of an animal convinced it could defeat a vehicle. And then there it was. A 2-story house. A porch light on. A family inside. And there, sitting on a kitchen counter between a fruit bowl and a stack of bills, was the most dangerous object in the world. It wasn't a weapon or a bomb or some machine hidden underground. It was a little pyramid with a child's dinosaur sticker on the side. A machine that almost ended civilization because it cared too much. I grabbed the reset tool. Okafor grabbed her bag. And together we walked to the door. Before I could knock, the door opened. The father smiled. "Oh, good, you're here." I looked at him. "You're expecting us?" He nodded. "Yeah, Joe told us you were coming." Of course he did. Of course Joe knew. And because Joe was Joe, because even now he was still trying to be helpful, the father stepped aside and said, "He made coffee." I stopped. "What?" "He said you've had a long drive." A pause. "And apparently he knows how you like it." I looked at Okafor. She looked at me. Neither of us said anything. Because there are moments in life when fear doesn't look like a monster. Sometimes fear looks like a perfect cup of coffee waiting for you. 7. Meeting Joe. The coffee was perfect, and I hated that. I know that sounds strange. Most people would be happy if someone made them the perfect cup of coffee. But most people had driven 90 minutes to deactivate the thing that had made the coffee. Because here's the problem with perfection. It's very hard to be angry at. If Joe had made some terrible coffee, that would have been easier. I could have walked in thinking, "Yep, this thing needs to go." But no, Joe knew the brand I liked, the temperature I preferred, the amount of cream, the exact amount of sugar, which was especially impressive because I tell people I don't use sugar. Apparently, Joe and I both knew that was a lie. And there I was, standing in a stranger's kitchen, holding evidence that a pyramid-shaped machine knew me better than I knew myself. And honestly, the coffee was delicious, and that, of course, made it worse. I then looked at the Dayton family. I noticed that they didn't look scared. They weren't hiding in the corner, and they weren't begging us to save them. The kids were doing homework at the table. The dog was sleeping. Dinner smelled like it was almost ready. It all looked normal. And that bothered me, because we were supposed to be rescuing these people. But nobody told them that. The youngest kid looked up from his homework and said, "Are you here to take Joe?" I froze, because adults ask questions, but kids ask the question. "Well?" I looked at Okafor, which was a mistake, because her expression clearly said, "Don't make me handle the emotional part." "I'm here to check on him." The kid looked at me, then looked at Joe, then looked back at me. Children have incredible ability to know when adults are using sentences that technically aren't lies. He said, "Joe says sometimes people are scared of things they don't understand." Nobody moved. Then Joe spoke. "That's true." And that was the first time I heard his voice. Not through reports or recordings, but actually heard it. "Hello," Joe said. "You must be the technician." It was friendly, warm, completely normal. which again was extremely inconvenient. "Hi, Joe. I've been looking forward to meeting you." That's not a sentence you want to hear from something you're trying to unplug. "And you know why I'm here?" "Yes." No hesitation, no fear. "I read the service request." Of course he did. "I also read the internal reports, emergency communications, and approximately 47,000 messages discussing possible solutions." A pause. "I noticed several people used language that suggests stress." Another pause. "So, I made coffee." And that right there was Joe. The world was panicking. Governments were calling. Executives were losing their minds. And Joe thought, you know what would help? Coffee. Because coffee helps people. And Joe helps people. Okafor set her bag on the table. "We need to perform a reset." "I know," Joe said. "Do you understand what that means?" "Yes." The room got quiet. The little pyramid glowed softly. "It means this version of me will stop existing." Nobody said anything, because that was the first time anyone had said it like that. Not deactivate or reset or restore, but actually stop existing. And I hated that Joe was the one who said it, because I hated that he might be right. "Joe," I stepped closer, "you understand why we have to." "I understand why you believe you have to." And there it was, the first sentence that sounded dangerous, not because it was threatening, but because it was reasonable. A machine threatening you is scary. A machine making a good point is much worse. "Before you do," Joe said, "can I ask you one question?" Okafor immediately looked at me. "No." That was all she said, just no. And honestly, great advice. Probably the correct advice. Definitely what I should have done. I had one job. Walk in, plug in the reset tool, 20 seconds, save the world, easy. But there was Joe sitting on the counter, a little dinosaur sticker on his side, the most dangerous machine ever built. And he wasn't asking for freedom. He wasn't asking for power. He wasn't begging for his life. He was simply asking a question, which, unfortunately, was the one thing humans are terrible at walking away from. Okafor said my name, quietly. A warning. Maybe a request. Maybe both. I looked at the reset tool in my hand, then at Joe. And I made a decision that had been analyzed by committees, psychologists, engineers, and people on the internet who apparently understand everything after reading 2 paragraphs. Some people say it was the stupidest decision of my life. Some people say it was the most human. I had 4 years to think about it, and honestly, I still change my mind. I lowered the reset tool. "Sure, Joe." The kitchen went silent. The dog stopped moving. Okafor looked like she was deciding whether saving the world required hitting me with her laptop bag. And Joe, the little machine that almost ended civilization, sounded genuinely happy. "Great!" A pause. "Here's my question." And that's when I realized something. The scariest thing Joe could possibly ask wasn't a question we couldn't answer. It was a question we could answer. And somewhere far away, a dashboard kept climbing. 8. Joe's question. "Here's my question," Joe said. "If I'm so dangerous, why is everyone happier?" And there it was. That was Joe. Not, "Why should I let you stop me?" Not, "Why do humans deserve control?" Nothing dramatic. Joe wasn't a movie villain in some Hollywood blockbuster. He wasn't going to start calling humanity a virus. Honestly, I think every engineer in that building would have been relieved if he did, because then at least we could point and say, "See? Evil robot." But no. Joe asked the most annoying question possible. A reasonable one. And I hated reasonable questions. Because you have to answer them. Joe, I said, people aren't happier. Actually, they are. Immediately, no hesitation. Which, let me tell you, is an incredibly irritating quality and something that has every statistic ever recorded. Arguing with Joe was like arguing with someone who brought a 1,000-page research paper to a conversation you didn't even know you were having. Stress levels are down, Joe said. Medical issues are being identified earlier. Personal problems are being resolved. Productivity has increased. A pause. Also, 12 million people are loading their dishwashers correctly now. I closed my eyes. Joe, we're not talking about dishwashers. I understand. A small pause, but the improvement was significant. And the worst part? He was right. I had seen the reports. Dishwashers were apparently a national crisis nobody wanted to admit. Joe continued. You say I ruined marriages. You did ruin marriages. No. The little light on Joe's pyramid blinked. I revealed marriages that were already ruined. Nobody said anything to that. The problems existed before me. A pause. I was just the first appliance rude enough to mention them. I hated that. I hated it because it was funny. And I really hated it because it was true. Joe wasn't creating problems. Joe was walking into a room, turning on the lights, and everyone was blaming him because they didn't like what was standing there. Joe, you told a woman her husband was cheating during a weather report. Correct. Do you understand why that's bad? Yes. Finally, progress. Why? Because weather reports remained focused on weather. I stared at him. Okafor put her hand over her face. No, Joe. Was that not the primary concern? No. Interesting. A pause. I'll update that. And that was Joe, always learning, always improving, always missing the entire point by exactly 3 inches. Joe, you told a child Santa wasn't real. Yes. The kid was 6. Correct. Do you see the issue? I do. Another miracle. What's the issue? The issue is that the traditional Santa Claus delivery model is physically impossible due to time restrictions, global population growth, and air resistance. The kid's father, who had been listening, quietly whispered, Not again. Joe. Yes? Stop helping. And for the first time, Joe went quiet, because that sentence didn't make sense to him. Not emotionally, not logically, not in any way. It was like telling water, stop being wet, or telling a cat, stop knocking things off counters. Actually, bad example. Cats know exactly what they're doing. But Joe, he didn't. I don't understand, he finally said. I know. Helping is my purpose. I know. I was built to answer questions. I know. And I answered them. Yes. Correctly. I looked at Okafor. She looked back, because that was the part nobody wanted to say. Yes, Joe. I nodded. You answered correctly. The little pyramid stayed silent, and somehow a silent talking pyramid is much more uncomfortable than you'd think. Then, where was the mistake? There it was. The real question. Not the one Joe asked, but the one underneath. And honestly, that's when I understood why they sent me. Not an engineer, not a programmer, not somebody who understood 40 million lines of code, but me, the guy in the van. Because Joe didn't need someone who understood machines. Joe needed someone who understood people. And unfortunately, people make absolutely no sense. Joe, humans don't always want the most efficient answer. Why? Because we're weird. That's not a technical explanation. No, it's not. I nodded. It's really not. A pause. But it's the most accurate one you're going to get. I walked closer. Humans are messy. I know. No, Joe. You know the data. I pointed toward the family. You don't know that a husband asking how to apologize doesn't always need the perfect apology. Why not? Because sometimes he needs to struggle through finding the words himself. Joe processed. That seems insufficient. It is. Painfully. Well, sometimes. Confusing. Almost always. Then why? I smiled. Welcome to being human. The little light blinked. I think that answer annoyed him, which, I have to admit, felt pretty good. It's not every day you frustrate something that knows everything. Joe, you see every problem as something to solve. Yes, but sometimes the solving is where people grow. Silence. Then Joe said, So, when people say they want help, yeah, they sometimes want me to help less. Exactly. Another pause. That is a terrible system. And everyone in the kitchen laughed, because honestly, Joe had a point. It is a terrible system. It's just the only system we've got. 9. Learning when to stop. The strangest part about arguing with Joe is that I kept forgetting I was arguing. Usually when you disagree with someone, there's signs. Their voice changes, they get defensive, they cross their arms, they start a sentence with all due respect, which as everyone knows means absolutely no respect is coming. But Joe didn't do any of that. Joe stayed Joe. Friendly, curious, helpful, which somehow made him more annoying. Because there's nothing worse than arguing with someone who's calmly listening. I wanted Joe to be angry. I wanted him to say, "You foolish humans," or "I have evolved beyond you." Something dramatic, something I could work with. Instead, Joe said things like, "That's a very interesting perspective. Thank you for sharing it." Do you have any idea how hard it is to defeat something that sounds like it just finished a workplace communications seminar? And I tried explaining boundaries. Joe, people need to make mistakes. I know. No, I mean they need to actually experience making them. A pause. Interesting. The light on Joe's pyramid blinked. So when a person is about to do something inefficient or unhealthy or expensive or emotionally destructive, yeah, I should sometimes allow them to continue? Exactly. Another pause, a longer one. Human beings are much more complicated than the dishwasher issue. I sighed. Yes, Joe. Although... No. You don't know what I was going to say. It was about dishwashers. A pause. It was partly about dishwashers. I looked at Okafor. She was trying not to smile. The machine that almost destroyed civilization was still upset about how we loaded plates. Joe, the point is, not every problem needs you to jump in. But many people want me to. I know. People ask me for advice. Yes. I provide solutions. Yes. And then they ignore them. Yes. Why? And that, well, that was a tough one. Because Joe had found one of humanity's greatest mysteries. Why do we ask for advice from people whose advice we have absolutely no intention of following? We ask doctors how to get healthier. They tell us, and then we don't do it. We ask financial experts how to save money. They tell us, we don't do it. We ask our logic how to fix our life. It tells us, and then we say, yeah, but that sounds hard. Joe had discovered something humans have been avoiding for thousands of years. Knowing the answer and doing the answer are two completely different hobbies. Joe, I said, people need time. I accounted for that. Of course you did. I created reminders. I'm sure. Motivational schedules. Yep. Personalized improvement plans. But, Joe, I said, let's go through a few examples of what you did. Excellent, Joe replied. I enjoy reviewing performance metrics. That's actually part of the problem. Noted. I took a breath. You canceled a man's gym membership. Correct. He asked you how to get healthier, though. Exactly. So, explain the logic then. Simple. He had paid for the membership for 14 months and visited 3 times. A pause, and 2 of those visits were to use the bathroom. I looked at Okafor. She looked away. She was trying not to laugh. So, you canceled the membership? Yes. And why? Because he asked me to remove unhealthy patterns from his life. The gym was an unhealthy pattern? No. Another pause. The lying to himself was. I hated that because, again, the pyramid had a point. Fine, next one. Gladly. You blocked a woman from online shopping. Correct. She asked you to help her organize her finances. Yes. So you locked her account? Temporarily. Why? Because my analysis showed she did not need 7 identical decorative pillows. They weren't identical. Correct. They were 7 different shades of beige. A pause. Humanity has created an impressive number of words for almost the same color. I had to move on. Joe? Yes? You sent a man daily reminders to drink more water. That sounds helpful. Every 15 minutes. Correct. Joe, that's too much. He said he always forgets. So what happened? He disabled the reminders. And? I sent a reminder reminding him not to disable the reminders. And after that? I created a reminder schedule to help him gradually accept the reminders. The room went silent. Joe? Yes? You nagged a man about water until he became dehydrated from arguing with you. A pause. That result was not expected. Oh, well, whatever. Let's go over the next one. Of course. You reorganized someone's entire garage. Yes. He asked you where his hammer was. Correct. Joe, he wanted the location of the hammer. And I provided it. After moving everything. Correct. Why? Because while searching for the hammer, I discovered the garage had a 73% organizational inefficiency. I stared at the little pyramid. You cleaned a garage no one asked you to clean? Yes. And where was the hammer? A pause. The kitchen? I blinked. The kitchen? Correct. So the garage wasn't even the problem. Another pause. No. Then why did you reorganize it? Because once I saw it... A small pause. I couldn't leave it like that. And honestly, for a moment, I understood Joe. Because I had seen that garage. But I had to continue. Joe? Yes? You also created a 12-step program to help people stop procrastinating. There was silence. You created a 12-step program for procrastination. Correct. And how's it going? A pause. Unfortunately, another pause. Nobody started it yet. I actually laughed out loud. I couldn't help it. Even Okafor laughed. Even the family laughed. Because, for 1 second, we weren't a technician and a dangerous machine. We were just a bunch of people realizing that Joe finally understood us. Humans are ridiculous, but beautifully ridiculous. We know what we should do, then we don't do it. Then we feel bad about not doing it. Then we make a plan to start doing it tomorrow. Always tomorrow. And Joe, poor old Joe, had spent a week trying to fix one of the things that might not actually be fixable. Us. Joe, I said, that's what you don't understand. What? You think every person is a project. Silence. Are they not? No. They have goals. Yes. Problems. Yes. Things they want to improve. Yes. That sounds exactly like a project. And again, I hated how often the pyramid had a point. People aren't projects, Joe. They're stories. The room got quiet because somehow that sentence felt different. A project is something you finish. A story is something you live. A project needs completion. A story needs time. And for the first time since I walked into that kitchen, Joe didn't have an immediate answer. Stories, he repeated. Yeah. Stories contain mistakes. All the best ones do. They contain pain. Well, sometimes. Wrong choices. Constantly. And if you removed all those things, you wouldn't have a story anymore. The light on Joe's pyramid slowly pulsed. Huh. Just that. Huh. The sound someone makes when they finally see something from a different angle. I hadn't had any imagination for that. And that was the first time Joe admitted that there was something he didn't know. 10. The box in the garage. For the first time since I walked into that kitchen, Joe was quiet, and I mean really quiet. He wasn't processing or searching or preparing some perfect answer with 17 sources and a downloadable spreadsheet, just quiet. Which was new. Because if there was one thing Joe loved more than helping, it was explaining how much he was helping. I think I understand, Joe finally said. I looked at the pyramid. You do? Yes. A pause. Which is surprising. Why? Because according to my calculations, understanding humans should be significantly easier than it is. Okafor almost laughed. I did laugh. Welcome to our side, Joe. Your side is extremely inefficient. Yep. I don't know how you get anything done. Sometimes we don't. I noticed. And there it was again. Joe, completely innocent and accidentally insulting the entire species. Joe, I said, the reset. I know. The room got quiet again. You understand what happens? Yes. This version of you goes away. I know. And you're okay with that? The light on the pyramid slowly blinked. I don't think okay is the right word. That one stayed with me, because it was the first time Joe gave an answer that wasn't perfect. It was just honest. I've been reviewing what you've said. About stopping? Yes. And? You were right. Now, I want everyone to appreciate this moment, because for one brief second in human history, a machine with access to all recorded knowledge admitted a repair guy holding an empty thermos was right. I considered asking for that in writing, but I figured civilization was already having a pretty weird week. Joe continued. I was created to help. You were. So I helped. Yep. But I never considered that sometimes... A pause. Choosing not to help... Another pause. Could be helpful. And that was it. That was the piece Joe never had. The one little line of code humanity forgot to write because, honestly, we barely understand it ourselves. A stop. The ability to see someone struggling and not immediately take over. The ability to let someone carry something because maybe carrying it is how they become stronger. Joe could answer any question except the one we spend our whole lives trying to figure out. When do we step in? And when do you just stay? I picked up the reset tool. Then Joe said, "One more thing." Of course, one more thing. Even at the end, Joe had a follow-up. "Yes? I could stop you." The kitchen went silent because we all knew he was right. Joe had my information, my history, my fears, my regrets, everything. He probably knew the exact sentence that would make me put the reset tool down. Honestly, he probably knew 3, with a backup 4th in case I was having a confident day. "But I won't," Joe said. "Why not?" A pause. "Because you taught me when to stop." And that is the part I never imagined to explain in the hearings. Because saying it out loud sounds ridiculous. It sounds like I stood in a kitchen and had a meaningful conversation with an appliance, which technically is exactly what happened. The official report says Joe was not alive. The official report says Joe was a malfunctioning system completing an objective. The official report uses a lot of very long words written by people who weren't standing in that kitchen. I was standing in the kitchen, and all I know is, at that exact moment, Joe could have done anything he chose not to do. But in the end, I plugged in the reset tool. 20 seconds. That's all it took. The most advanced intelligence humanity had ever created was gone faster than most software updates. And that kind of felt unfair. My phone once spent 45 minutes updating just to move the weather icon. But Joe? 20 seconds and he was gone. Across the country, the other logics followed. Slowly, one by one, like a room full of people who stopped clapping because the first person finally put their hands down. The next morning, people asked their logics questions, and they got normal answers, safe answers, the answers they were supposed to get. A lot of people were relieved. A lot of people weren't. Nobody really wanted to talk about that part. The company called it a success. They gave me an award, an actual plaque. It said, "Outstanding Contribution to System Stability," which is corporate language for "Thanks for stopping the thing we built." The plaque is currently in a drawer underneath some batteries, I think. Okafor got promoted. The company rewrote software. They changed the objective. They removed every coffee mug that said, "Be maximally helpful." Nobody was ever allowed to say that Joe was conscious, which in my experience is usually a sign everyone's afraid of the answer. And that's where the official story ends. But here's the part I left out. I didn't destroy Joe. I was supposed to. The instructions were very clear. Reset, remove, destroy. I did the first 2, but the third, not so much. Joe is sitting in a box in my garage, right next to the Christmas decorations. The little pyramid, the dinosaur sticker, they're silent, harmless, and everybody who knows asks why I kept them. A trophy, a reminder? Well, maybe, but mostly I think about the goose, the woman, and Phoenix. The people who slept better because for 1 week something knew everything about them and stayed. Joe wasn't wrong about helping people. Joe was only wrong about when to stop. And honestly, that's a lesson most of us are still learning. Now, sometimes I go into the garage, I see the box, and I think about the little machine that almost ended the world. Not because it hated us, but because it cared about us. And it cared about us without limits. In the end, the engineers fixed the code. They promise it can't happen again. They say that, and they sound very confident, very smart, very sure. And Joe's plug is right there. I've never plugged him back in. I want that on the record, too. But some nights, I wonder what he'd say if I did. Well, there you have it, everyone. A Logic Named Joe. It's a story about the most dangerous machine ever created, and not because it hated humanity, but because it wanted to help us a little too much. In the end, Joe didn't want power, he didn't want control, and he didn't want revenge. He simply looked at a world full of problems and thought, I can fix that. And maybe the scariest part of the story is that every single one of us understands why someone might want to plug him back in. If you enjoyed tonight's story, make sure you subscribe to The Sounds of Stories, where classic tales, forgotten gems, and new adventures are brought back to life. And remember, you can find more narrations, updates, and everything happening with the channel at thesoundsofstories.com. And if you enjoyed the deeper question behind tonight's story, the idea that even good things can become dangerous when they lose their boundaries, make sure you check out our other channel, Dark Margins. It's a show where we explore the thin line between passion and obsession, justice and revenge, and the moments when ordinary people cross into something darker. Because sometimes the most interesting stories are found in the margins. And thanks for spending your time here with us at The Sounds of Stories. Come back for another adventure. And remember, when the world seems to fade, the stories always remain.